They called her the woman who vanished without leaving. An heiress to a copper mining empire, she was born into more money than most could imagine. And yet, for the last 2 decades of her life, no one in the public ever saw her. No interviews, no photographs, not even a hint that she still existed outside the quiet, sealed room she inhabited. In 2011, when the news broke that Huguette Clark had died at the age of 104, it wasn't her passing that stunned the world. It was the discovery of what she had left behind. Over $300 million and no clear answer as to why she had lived and died in almost total secrecy. Before we begin, subscribe to *Silent Heirs*, where the wealth of the dead still whispers to the living. To understand the mystery, you have to start in 1906, when Huguette was born into the kind of privilege that didn't just open doors, it built them. Her father, William A. Clark, was one of the richest men in America, a copper tycoon with a reputation for both relentless ambition and scandal. He was 67 when Huguette was born. Her mother, Anna, was barely half his age. They lived in an opulent Manhattan mansion, 121 rooms, marble staircases, ballrooms, and walls lined with rare art. From the outside, it was a world built for fairy tales, but fairy tales have shadows. Huguette grew up surrounded by wealth, yes, but also by whispers. Her father was powerful but deeply controversial, accused of bribery in the U.S. Senate and criticized for his ruthless business practices. The Clark family learned early to keep their private lives guarded. For Huguette, that privacy became a fortress, and eventually a prison. Her childhood was quiet, her education cultured and refined. She spoke fluent French, played music, painted delicate watercolors. She married once, briefly in her early 20s, a union so short and unhappy it was dissolved in under a year. After that she never married again. She had no children, no heirs, and then the slow vanishing began. In the 1920s and 30s, Huguette appeared in society pages. By the 1940s, she was rare. By the 1950s, she was gone. Yet she didn't move to some faraway land. She remained in New York, in her massive Fifth Avenue apartment, a sprawling space overlooking Central Park. The curtains were always drawn. The doorman rarely saw her. For the last 20 years of her life, not even her relatives could say they had spoken to her in person. This is where the story takes its first sharp turn, from reclusion into something stranger. Huguette wasn't hiding because she had to. She wasn't bankrupt. She wasn't under threat. She simply withdrew. She paid meticulous attention to her possessions, to her small circle of trusted staff, and to the objects she loved, her antique dolls, her paintings, her collections. Her world became smaller and smaller until it was just her, behind closed doors, with her fortune quietly growing in the background. And then in the 1990s, something happened. A health scare, minor, according to some accounts, led her to be admitted to a New York hospital. She never left. Not for a week, not for a month. She stayed in that hospital room for the next 2 decades, paying millions of dollars in bills without complaint, insisting on the privacy of her space. Nurses came and went, but she remained. It was as though she had removed herself from the living world entirely, while still breathing. When she died in May 2011, the hospital bed sheets were still neatly tucked under her fragile frame. She was a ghost before she was gone, and then the will was read. The amount, $300 million, was staggering. But it wasn't the number that caught the attention of the press, the public, and eventually investigators. It was who she left it to. There were no children, no surviving siblings. Instead, there were hospital staff, her private nurse, distant friends, and charities. Even a goddaughter she hadn't seen in decades. Many of her blood relatives, distant cousins who had never been allowed past her closed doors, were left out entirely. That's when the real mystery began. Was this the will of a perfectly lucid, eccentric woman who simply wanted her fortune distributed on her terms? Or had her isolation left her vulnerable, manipulated in her final years by those who were closest to her? The battle lines were drawn almost immediately. Relatives claimed foul play. Lawyers claimed the will was ironclad. The media, hungry for the image of a mad heiress, ran stories painting her as a woman controlled by her obsessions and her fear of the outside world. But the truth was stranger than the headlines. You see, there were tax records, old, meticulous filings, that painted a different picture of Huguette's final decades. Records that revealed where the money really went. And they suggested that far from being out of her mind, she had been orchestrating her own strange, deliberate plan all along. The question wasn't just why she gave her fortune the way she did. It was what she was trying to protect asterisk. The tax records were buried deep, pages upon pages of neatly itemized transactions, signed in an elegant hand that hadn't changed in 60 years. No one expected them to tell a story, but they did. And that story began to unravel the public's version of who Huguette Clark was. The first revelation was how precise she had been. Her expenses weren't the careless splurges of a detached billionaire. Every dollar was accounted for, every gift documented, every transfer intentional. In the years she lived inside that hospital room, she was still paying property taxes on her Fifth Avenue apartment, empty, dust-covered, yet meticulously maintained. She was paying similar taxes on a Connecticut mansion she hadn't stepped into for decades, and on a sprawling California estate on the Pacific coast, fully staffed, though she hadn't set foot there since the 1950s. It was as if she were keeping the houses alive, even as she receded from them. And then there were the gifts. Over the years, Huguette gave away millions, not in lump sums to charities but in personal, hand-picked amounts to individuals. A nurse's child's tuition, a building superintendent's retirement fund, a distant cousin's quiet loan never to be repaid. There was no pattern that made sense to outsiders, but to Huguette, each was deliberate. One detail stood out. In the late 1990s, she began directing large payments toward the restoration of rare objects, antique dolls, paintings, and musical instruments. Some were items she owned, others strangely were not. She funded restorations for museums and private collectors, sometimes anonymously, sometimes under her own name. The amounts were staggering, and the IRS filings confirmed them all. To most people, this might have seemed like a whimsical hobby. But for investigators looking into her estate, it hinted at something more deliberate, a preservation of beauty, perhaps, or a fixation on controlling time itself. And yet, the strangest line item wasn't a gift or a property tax. It was a steady stream of payments, year after year, to a private law firm in Montana. Not New York, not California, Montana. The birthplace of her father's empire. These payments were quiet, buried among hospital expenses and art restoration costs. When questioned, the attorneys claimed they handled family matters for Miss Clark, but they refused to elaborate. The relatives, those who'd been cut out of her will, were convinced this was where the conspiracy lived. They claimed someone in Montana was hiding assets, perhaps even siphoning funds from her estate. But the deeper investigators looked, the less certain the picture became. The Montana accounts weren't growing, they were shrinking. Slowly, steadily, as if money was being spent on something with no resale value. Something that left no paper trail except the withdrawal itself. It was in those Montana records that the first whispers of the sealed vault emerged. Rumor had it that William A. Clark, Huguette's father, had stored away more than copper profits. There were stories of rare gold ingots, maps to mineral-rich land, and even correspondence with foreign dignitaries from the early 1900s. If the vault existed, Huguette would have been the last living person with the legal right to open it. And if she had, she'd left no note, no clue, and no inventory. Her tax filings showed one more oddity. She had paid large sums to a private courier service, always routed from New York to Montana, and always marked personal effects. Whatever those effects were, they never appeared in her estate inventory after her death. By now, the family feud had turned into a courtroom war. The relatives accused her nurse, her lawyers, and even the hospital of exerting undue influence to siphon the estate. They claimed she'd been isolated and manipulated in her final years, too frail to know what she was signing. But her tax records argued otherwise. They showed a woman fully in control, orchestrating her finances with the same meticulous care she'd had her entire life. The court eventually reached a settlement. Some of the money went to the family, some to the nurse and other beneficiaries, and millions to a charity for the arts. But the unanswered questions remained. Where had the Montana money gone? What had been in those personal effects shipments? In the years since, a few pieces have surfaced. A gold pocket watch engraved with her father's name. A stack of letters between William A. Clark and an unknown Russian diplomat. A map with markings in the mountains outside Butte, Montana, now in the hands of a private collector. Each time one of these artifacts emerges, it's sold quietly, often disappearing into another locked collection. Some believe these pieces are only fragments, and that the real heart of Huguette's fortune, the thing she spent her life protecting, was never part of her estate at all. That whatever she sent to Montana is still there, untouched, waiting. The question now isn't just about the money. It's about whether Huguette Clark spent her life hiding from the world, or guarding it from something she didn't trust it to have. And the final clue, her last recorded tax entry before her death, might reveal which it was. Her final tax entry was dated just weeks before her death, a neatly penned signature at the bottom of a return that included one extraordinary expense. A single payment to the Montana law firm, double her usual annual amount, marked only with the word closure. No description, no explanation. Just that one word, typed, not handwritten, as if it had been added by someone else, someone who wanted to make sure it was noticed, or wanted to leave just enough for it to haunt. To the lawyers handling her estate, it was just another mystery line in decades of eccentric bookkeeping. But to those who had been following her trail for years, it was the most significant clue yet. Theories bloomed overnight. Some believed closure meant she had finally emptied the vault, that whatever her father had hidden was now gone, placed somewhere beyond reach. Others whispered about private sales to anonymous buyers, the kind that never see a bank ledger. And a few, those who knew the oldest Clark family rumors, wondered if it was something darker. There had always been talk of a ledger, a single book that William A. Clark kept hidden from his official accounts. Not a ledger of money, but of names, names of politicians, industrialists, and foreign powers who had made secret deals with him in the early days of his empire. In an era before disclosure laws, such a record would have been a weapon, one that could shatter reputations even a century later. If it existed, and if Huguette had inherited it, keeping it locked away could explain her obsessive secrecy. And yet, the tax records showed no insurance premiums on a vault's contents, no storage fees in Montana after 2011. Whatever closure was, it meant the account was finished. But here's where the unease grows. Days before the entry, a courier logged a final delivery from New York to Montana, marked again as personal effects. The receipt for this shipment is missing from the IRS copies. The tracking number leads to a dead end, as if the courier company itself had erased it from their system. In her hospital room, nothing of significance was found. Her most expensive jewelry was long gone. The famous Stradivarius violin she once owned had been sold years earlier. Even her dolls, hundreds of them, were carefully packed and transferred elsewhere before her death. The nurse who had been closest to her claimed not to know where they went. The settlement of her estate was supposed to be the end of the story. The court had divided the money, the public had gorged itself on the eccentric recluse headlines, and the relatives, though bitter, had signed the final paperwork. But months later, one of the Montana attorneys was found dead in his home, his safe emptied. Local police ruled it a burglary. Nothing in the press tied it to Huguette Clark. Officially, there was no connection at all. Unofficially, whispers began to spread. 2 more former employees of the same law firm retired abruptly and left the country. A private investigator who had been hired by a distant Clark relative claimed to have tracked a portion of the missing personal effects to a secure facility in Switzerland. He died of a heart attack before he could retrieve them. And then there's the final haunting detail. The Montana property taxes on a small, unassuming brick building, owned by an anonymous trust, are still being paid every year without fail. The payment arrives from an account that on paper no longer exists. People like to think of Huguette Clark as a ghost who faded away. But the truth is, she didn't fade. She moved piece by piece, behind a wall that no one has been able to break through. She left $300 million in plain sight, and yet it feels like only the decoy. Some believe she spent her last 20 years building the perfect illusion. An old, lonely woman with too much money, distracted by her toys and her art. All the while, she may have been guarding something far more dangerous, something worth far more than her public fortune, something her father never meant to leave in anyone else's hands. The public thinks her story ended in 2011. But if you follow the payments, the couriers, the unclaimed properties, they suggest a different ending entirely. One that hasn't happened yet. Because if Huguette Clark's real treasure is still hidden, someone somewhere is still watching over it. And maybe, just maybe, they're waiting for the right time to open it. And so, the mystery of Huguette Clark isn't just about wealth. It's about what we'll never see, the truths buried with her, and the shadows that still stretch from her life into ours. If the tax records tell us anything, it's that money can hide more than it reveals. And sometimes, the richest secrets are the ones no one dares to claim. If you want more stories of fortunes, mysteries, and the silent heirs who leave the world guessing, subscribe to Silent Heirs. Because the dead may be gone, but their secrets are never buried for long.